PokeClass is sponsored by CollectorsCash.com, and they now have Dark Explorers in stock at incredible prices. Are you looking for that last card to complete your deck, or looking to boost your collection in any set of the game? Then Collector's Cash is where you need to be. They stock all of your boxes, tins, and singles of Pokemon, and any other card game for that matter, at very competitive prices. So make sure you visit www.collectorscash.com after the show. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 73 of PokeClass, and today I'm going to be talking about probably my last deck analysis of the current season, which is Terrakion and Groudon EX. What this deck does is pretty much what Terrakion did used to do by taking advantage of the double fight and weakness of both Zekrom and the new deck archetype Darkrai EX, but pair it with the new Groudon EX from Dark Explorers. Both of these fighting types hit hard and really fast in some cases, so without further ado I'm going to be doing the usual, giving you a skeleton list, a list of text, and give you an idea of how to play the deck too. Let's get to it. So as mentioned in the intro, we're going to be looking at the Terrakion Groudon deck with a few tech options as well, but I'll get to those later on. And the basic idea of the deck is to just hit for weakness on pretty much the two top decks in the format at the moment. Darkrai EX especially, and Zekrom as well, gives it a bit of trouble. So just hitting for double weakness with these pretty strong attacks from suffering a KO, and now with Groudon you can just go on the offensive straight away without having to suffer a KO and without having to get too many energy on the board. And even against stuff that isn't double fighting weak, it still has pretty good matchups because of the Groudon, which can let you be a lot more offensive with your Pokemon and clean up a bit easier with Terrakion. So without further ado, let's get onto the skeleton list, which is just here, and we start off with the Pokemon and 4 Terrakion from Noble Victories. Terrakion, most of you should be familiar with by now, has 130 HP, it's a fighting type, and that's pretty much all you need to know about it really. The weakness is almost irrelevant because not much grass Pokemon are out there at the moment, bar Virizion and possibly the occasional rogue Excelgor you could see later on, and the full retreat cost isn't too much of a problem either because you have a lot of switch in this deck. Onto the attacks, and for a fighting energy and a colorless, Retaliate does 30 damage, and if any of your Pokemon were knocked out in the previous turn by your opponent, then the attack does 60 more damage, maxing out at 90 damage. Now if you equate the double fighting weakness into that damage output, that comes to about 180 damage without anything like plus powers, Eviolites, defenders, whatever sponges damage. Now that's actually pretty strong. It can revenge kill most things, almost everything that is fighting weak when it's got nothing on it at all. So Darkrai without an Eviolite, it will KO most things in Zekrom, pretty much everything in Zekrom that's lightning type and fighting weak, but it's just a really strong revenge killer, which will take out anything that you've softened up with either Groudon's first attack or just in previous turns, and can just clear up some Pokemon that are giving you trouble. Now the second attack for an extra fighting energy, Land Crush, does 90 damage, which I'm sure you all know, and it's just a basic beat stick attack, has no catches, just 3 energy, 90 damage, and it just means that you don't need to be KO'd first before needing to do 90 damage, and pretty much comes into play during the late game. So moving on, and you have to Groudon EX, which is one of the new powerful EXs from Dark Explorers. It features 180 HP as most EXs do, and its first attack does 20 damage for a fighting and a colorless, and then does 10 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And yeah, it's just a really strong attack in the early game. It can get 40 damage hits on stuff that's double fighting weak, just to soften them up in the early game, and it softens up stuff on the bench as well for later on. Tromp obviously has great synergy with its second attack, Giant Claw, for an extra fighting energy, so that's 2 fighting energy and a colorless. It does 80 damage, and if the defending Pokemon already has 2 or more damage counters on it, this attack does 40 more damage. So obviously that maxes out at 120, but if you take into account the 2 damage counters that your defending Pokemon may already have on it or needs to have on it to do 120, that's 160 damage on anything. That's not even counting double fighting weakness or anything else. So as you can imagine, anything that has 2 damage counters on it and is fighting weak will get KO'd by Giant Claw. There's nothing to save it unless you have something ridiculous like 4 defenders, an Eviolite and everything else. A Giant Claw will do 120 times 2, which is 240 to anything that's fighting weak. So that takes out anything in the format that is fighting weak, pretty much. Darkrai will suffer to this when you get it set up. Obviously, it isn't the fastest of attacks, but when you pair it with the small energy acceleration you've got later on and one of the Pokemon I'm going to talk about in a second, you can get this going pretty fast. And when you've started to build up the damage with Tromp and Terrakion's first and second attacks, you can really start doing some heavy damage in the late game, really taking apart these top 2 decks. So next, you obviously have 2 Mewtwo, and this deck originally didn't run Mewtwo, it just ran 4 Terrakion, but I really feel that Mewtwo powered up to the fullest with like a ridiculous amount of energy on it, which can happen a lot, just really can give this deck some trouble. So putting in your own Mewtwo and a Shaman, which is the next Pokemon on the list, just a single one, will help you to move energy around and get a surprise KO on your opponent's Mewtwo. Now, don't get me wrong, Groudon can take a Mewtwo on head first with its 80 damage and plus 40, or soften it up with Tromp first if your opponent's had to start with it or something like that. And Terrakion is a really good revenge killer for it as well. So if a Groudon does get KO'd by a Mewtwo, if it's got some damage on it already, you can add to the damage with Retaliate, do a soft 90 damage, and take it out later on. But just having 2 of your own Mewtwo's means that you can X-ball it, and just gives you another strong attacker to add to your arsenal. And last, as I just mentioned, is Shaman from Unleashed, which has Celebration Wind, which allows you to move all your energy around as soon as Shaman comes into play, just once when it hits the bench. What this allows you to do is power up stuff like a fresh Groudon. Say your Groudon in the active spot is heavily damaged, you have Switch and Shaman in hand, you can use the Switch, promote the fresh Groudon, and start hitting even harder without your opponent taking 2 prizes. Now what this also does is, as I mentioned just now, is power up a Mewtwo in one go. Obviously, you do run 2 double colors, but there's no way to search it out in this deck, and they're pretty precious. You only run 2, not the 4 like Zekromiel's will. And you're not going to be able to attach 3 energy in one turn with this deck unless you attach an experience share to your Mewtwo, which is also an option. Shaman just allows you to attach to it and use Celebration Wind to move your energy around onto it to take KOs on your opponent's Mewtwo's or other heavily powered EXs that are giving you trouble. It just helps you to keep in the game, and definitely a mandatory conclusion in my opinion. So that's pretty much your Pokemon for the deck, and I'm just going to move on to the trainers and supporters, which there are a lot of. So I'm going to start off with my standard 4 Juniper, 4 Pon and 3 N line. This is pretty much standard in almost all deck lists at the minute, bar ones that run Trainer Lock and stuff like that, which we don't see anymore. And just seems to be the most consistent trainer line at the moment. You can opt to play more of one supporter, like take out one of either Professor Juniper and Pon and put in another N. That just makes your late game disruption a lot better, especially when you've got a fully powered Groudon smashing through all their Pokemon. It can really hurt the opponent and stop them from making a comeback as well. This set of 11 supporters paired with 2 random receiver, which is a little bit lower on the list, just gives you the most consistency as possible. You have 2 random receiver and 4 junk arm to use it later on, and will just keep your supporters coming as quickly as possible since you don't run any other kind of draw support in the deck. You can go lower and max the random receiver count, so you could go down to 4 Juniper and 4 Pon and then just max the random receiver, which is also an option if you're looking for an extra space. So yeah, change it up for how you feel. Next up, another standard line of 4 Junk Arm, 4 Catcher, which I'm sure really doesn't need explaining anymore. Junk Arm just lets you get back the trainer resources you use in the early game, just for the late game, stuff you have to Juniper away you can just save, and Catcher just lets you select your targets throughout the game. Having a maximum amount of them just lets you revenge kill what you like and take cheap prizes where you can. Next up is pretty much your main card in the deck, which is Experience Share, which is your energy acceleration of the deck. Most decks that are good at the moment need some kind of energy acceleration. So in Zekromiel's we have Electric, Darkrai we have Dark Patch, and in here we have Experience Share. And what it allows you to do is a Pokemon tool, so you attach it to one of your Pokemon, preferably on the bench. And what happens is when your active gets knocked out with energy on it, you move one of the energy from that onto the Pokemon that has Experience Share on it, and then choose which Pokemon to promote. So what this does is, say you have a Terrakion with 3 energy on it and it gets KO'd, you have an Experience Share on your Groudon. The Groudon will take one of the fighting energy, and yeah, that's pretty much it. It takes one of the fighting energy and saves it from going into the discard pile. What this does is keep your attackers coming every single turn and make sure that you always have energy on board. Up next is 3 Heavy Ball, which is your main search from the deck. It doesn't require a flip and searches out 6 of your Pokemon that you need. The reason for not running 4 heavy ball is because if you look at the bottom of the list, I've put 1 dual ball, simply because you do run 3 other basics in here, and 1 dual ball paired with 4 Junkarm should be able to fetch you those at the right time. 3 switch just allows you to keep your board as flexible as possible. If you've got a Groudon on the active spot that you don't really want there and can power up Terrakion this turn, or anything else, any other situation, then you can just use switch or Junkarm for it later on and get Pokemon you don't want in the active spot out of the active spot. Next up, random receiver, which I've kind of already talked about, so I'll move on. It's just a consistency booster. So up next is 2+ power. You're going to need this to take out some things that aren't fighting weak, or take care of things that are fighting weak and have Eviolite attached. For example, a Darkrai with Eviolite will survive a Terrakion's Retaliate attack if you've been KO'd the previous turn, but if you play plus power, then it still gets the KO, so it just stops things like Eviolite being more of a problem than they need to be. And I've already explained dual ball, so I'll move on to the last card, which is Revive. And I play Revive over Super Rod because all your Pokemon are basics. You only run 9 basics, 8 of which you're going to need to use Revive for. And it's just your main recovery for the deck. You don't run that many Pokemon, and when you can't draw into them or search them out, you can just use Revive and stick them straight onto the bench again. And that's pretty much your trainers and supporters. I'll get to some techs in a minute that you can use your free space for. You've got 4 free spaces in this, which is quite a lot. And quickly talk about your energy. You have 2 double colorless and 10 fighting. 10 fighting seems to be the right amount to make sure you hit those energy drops and make sure you keep them in play with experience share pretty much. 2 double colorless is obviously for Mewtwo when your opponent's, just attacks with another Mewtwo. You can put down double colorless, you don't even need to use Shaman. And just make sure you can get Mewtwo out and revenge KOing as soon as possible. And that is pretty much your list. It's very simple and straightforward. If you're looking for a deck that isn't too complicated, then definitely give this a spin. So some tech options for you. First off, I would definitely recommend one of 2 other tools, which are Eviolite and Rocky Helmet. Eviolite is really good for just buffering that damage against Groudon and Terrakion. Both of them, Terrakion can get KO'd by a plus powered Bolt Strike, which does happen quite a bit, and when that's targeted with a 2 or 3 energy on it, it does put you behind a lot, especially when you're missing those experience share drops. It just gives it a lot more HP so it can withstand more attacks, and gives Groudon just that even more HP that it's already got. It would get you at 200 HP effectively if your opponent's hitting for 1 attack, and just makes it more harder to KO, so it's definitely an inclusion you could make. And one of my favorites in this deck is Rocky Helmet, since Groudon's second attack needs 2 damage counters on the defending Pokemon for it to be at its max damage output. Rocky Helmet is a nice inclusion, since when they start to hit into Groudon, which they really need to do to stop this deck from rolling straight through them, is that they automatically take that 2 damage, so you don't have to put the damage on them at all. That means you can then power up your Groudon and make sure you can get that 120 damage attack off straight away. It's a really nice inclusion in the deck, and I definitely recommend you try at least 2 out. But you do have to be careful because you do run experience share. You can't replace tools when they've already been attached. You have to be a bit more careful with your tool drops, but it just helps out a lot when you need to get that extra damage and you're just trying to sweep with Groudon EX. Definitely try it out. Another idea for techs is that you could use either Super Scoop Up or Max Potion, both of which focus on healing your damaged EXs when your opponent has to 2-shot them. Pretty much nothing can one-hit KO Groudon EX except for a heavily powered up Mewtwo, so they're definitely going to have to be 2-shotting you, which isn't bad since you give up 2 prizes, but if they hit you once and you can use Super Scoop Up or Max Potion to get rid of all your damage, that puts your opponent behind a step. Also, running Super Scoop Up helps you with Shaman. If you start with Shaman, you're still going to be able to use it. You can use Shaman multiple times during a game if you get the right flips. It's just a really strong card to have. Keeping your EXs alive for longer than they need to be really can win you games sometimes, so definitely try these out. And finally, you can try a different version of the deck with Crushing Hammers and Loss Removers. Basically, what Terrakion used to do when you had just 4 Terrakion in a deck was play Crushing Hammers and Loss Removers to slow your opponent down while you picked up pace, since this deck doesn't really have a strong early game, but since you run Groudon, Mewtwo and Shaman, those spaces are taken up. So basically you have 4 free spaces which you can easily fit 3 Crushing Hammer and a Loss Remover in, or vice versa. Crushing Hammer helps just to pound on stuff that doesn't have energy acceleration, such as the Mirror Match. And Lost Remove is really strong against your biggest problem, Tornadus EX. Tornadus EX with an Eevee-like can give you issues, but to cover this you can also run Ruins of Alph. Both Lost Remover and Ruins of Alph will mess with Tornadus a lot because you will get rid of their double colorless energy, which means they won't be able to attack as frequently. And if you keep Junk Arm in that Lost Remover, you will be getting rid of all their energy and making Tornadus just a sitting duck, really. And Ruins of Alph just means you can make your maximum damage output. Groudon EX will be able to two-shot a Tornadus EX when it's got damage on it, so it's not too much of an issue, but when regarding Terrakion and when you can't get something going as quick as they can, definitely include something like Lost Remover to slow them down to your pace so that you can pick up for later on. And that is pretty much your Terrakion Groudon deck for you. It's a really interesting deck. It's definitely an anti-meta deck and really fun to play actually. When you include stuff like Rocky Helmet and Super Scoop Up, it really can give stuff like Darkrai and Zekromeals a run for its money, and other things like CMT and whatever else is out there at the moment. So definitely give this a try. It's fairly cheap if you want to run the version without Mewtwo EX, even though Mewtwo's have come down a little bit since the tin announcement. And yes, it's really fun to try if you're looking for something other than Darkrai or Zekromeals to play at the moment. Definitely try it out. It's doing fairly well at some battle roads at the moment. I think it's in 3rd place at the moment for the most wins. And yeah, it's just a great deck. So thanks for watching this episode of PokeClass. Please rate, comment and subscribe as usual. I read all your comments and try to reply to them all as well. I just enjoy reading them. So please leave them down below. And thanks for watching.